The grit of the juniper rail yard was a constant metallic flavor on Elias's tongue. It was not merely the dust, it was the microscopic decay of 1,000 abandoned journeys, the rust of forgotten ambitions. He was 11 years old, but his shoulders carried the hunch of 70 years of worry, tightening against the November wind that scoured the industrial skeleton of the city's underbelly. Elias had been moving for 3 days, driven by a raw, unspecific fear that clung to his spine like frozen sweat. His inventory was meager: a half-eaten sleeve of stale crackers, a broken compass whose needle spun endlessly, mocking the lack of any fixed direction in his life, and the heavy, saturated blue denim jacket that felt more like a shroud than a shield against the biting cold. He had spotted the anomaly through a fissure in a crumbling concrete retaining wall, not a typical rail car, battered and tagged with obscene graffiti, but something long, dark, and utterly silent. It was protected by an insurmountable hedge of tangled blackberry brambles, sharp and unforgiving, that acted as nature's defense against urban encroachment. This particular corner of the yard, known locally and irreverently as the Dead Spur, was too deep, too overgrown, and too acoustically isolated for casual investigation. The effort required to breach the perimeter was exhaustive. Elias spent nearly 2 hours utilizing a shard of broken pavement he had designated his digging stone, slowly tearing away at the thick, unforgiving roots of the weeds. Each pull on the brambles resulted in a sharp, stinging payment across his knuckles and forearms. The skin was pale, taut, and easily breached, leaving angry red welts that instantly seeped tiny droplets of blood. He ignored the pain. The promise of an enclosed space, a place where the wind could not reach him, outweighed any physical discomfort. When the gap was finally wide enough, he slid through, scraping his hip bone against a jutting piece of rebar. The pain made him gasp, a thin, wheezing sound immediately swallowed by the colossal silence of the area. He stood up, brushing damp earth from his trousers, and stared at the object of his desperate labor. It was a streamlined passenger train, painted a dull, aged silver that had once been brilliant chrome. It was massive, spanning what looked like 7 or 8 cars, stretching into the gloom like a slumbering leviathan. This was not cargo, this was luxury, decay frozen in time. The windows were dark, opaque with internal grime and the external accumulation of decades of dust. But they were remarkably intact. He approached the nearest car, Car 3, according to a small, faded numerical placard bolted near the doorway. The scent here was distinct: thick oil, iron oxide, and an underlying faint sweetness, like dried lavender pressed between heavy pages. It was completely unlike the acrid stench of garbage and urine that characterized the rest of the rail yard. The door was heavy, built for permanence and speed, not ease of entry. Elias pushed on the handle, a cold, oxidized brass fixture shaped like a stylized eagle head. It did not budge. Panic, cold and sharp, threatened to send him back into the open air, but the image of the previous night, spent shivering beneath a rusted awning, plagued by the terrifying shapes the shadows conjured, forced him to persist. He examined the coupling mechanism. These trains were old. Perhaps there was a service hatch or a slightly misaligned maintenance panel. His fingers, numb with the cold but possessing the hypersensitivity of necessity, explored the edges of the metal. Near the rear buffer plate, he found it. A small rectangular panel, slightly ajar, rattling almost imperceptibly in the stillness. He wedged his digging stone into the crack and applied pressure. The sound was a loud, protesting screech of metal against metal, an intolerable violation of the deep silence. He froze, heart hammering against his ribs, listening for any sign of human response. A security guard, another vagrant. Nothing. The rail yard remained silent, vast, and uncaring. Elias pulled the panel back. It was not a door, but a ventilation access point. leading into the narrow corridor between the external wall and the interior paneling of the car. It was too small to squeeze through directly, but his small frame afforded him a chance. He had to enter sideways, twisting his body sharply, his jacket catching and ripping slightly on a sharp burr of metal. The passage was tight, smelling strongly of old insulation and dry rot. He shuffled forward until he reached an internal junction point, a service door slightly warped, held shut by the pressure of the car's weight against the rails. This door was thinner, less secure. A few focused kicks with the heel of his boot, small, desperate impacts, and the wood of the door frame splintered, allowing the latch to pop free with a soft thunk. He tumbled inward, landing on a thick, patterned carpet that muffled the sound entirely. Elias was inside car 3. The light filtering in was minimal, heavily polluted by dust motes performing a slow, glittering dance in the shafts of weak afternoon sun that pierced the grimy windows. This was a sleeper car. Ahead of him stretched a narrow aisle flanked by closed compartment doors, each marked by a small, darkened glass number plate. The air inside was thick, stale, and warm. It held a temperature distinct from the outside world, a preserved pocket of stillness. The warmth was immediate comfort, softening the edges of his desperate fear. Elias stood motionless for several minutes, allowing his eyes to adjust and his racing breath to slow. He was safe, for now. He moved cautiously down the aisle, his worn sneakers sinking slightly into the deep pile of the carpet. He tried the first compartment door, locked. The second, locked. The third door he tried, however, yielded to the pressure of his palm. It slid open with a whisper of brass on runners. This compartment was small, designed for 2 people, featuring plush velvet seating and a small fold-down table fixed beneath the window. The bunk beds were still made, the sheets heavy linen, untouched but for the dust. Everything was meticulously preserved, a snapshot from an era before he was born. The colors were muted, deep maroons, oxidized brass, and dark, teak wood paneling. Elias closed the door, sealing himself within the small, 4-walled universe. He sat on the lower bunk. The springs sighed softly beneath his weight. A deep, weary exhalation that sounded almost human. For the next few hours, he did nothing but breathe, watching the slow retreat of the sun through the cloudy glass. The realization of his absolute isolation in this massive, silent structure should have been terrifying. Instead, it was an immense relief. No one knew he was here. He was invisible, a ghost finding refuge among relics. He began to examine his surroundings in the dimming light. He needed water, food. On the small bedside shelf, tucked beneath a forgotten copy of a local newspaper, dated so long ago the ink smeared under his thumb, he found a glass tumbler. It was heavy, cut crystal coated in dust. He polished it with the cuff of his jacket. It was useless here, but the weight felt good, solid. In the small bathroom cabinet, he discovered a nearly full tube of old mint-scented toothpaste and a toothbrush, stiff with age, but usable. These were luxuries. Later, as darkness achieved dominance outside, Elias pulled a heavy wool blanket from the top bunk. The wool smelled faintly of mothballs and something else, a clean, almost antiseptic scent, like very old soap. He wrapped himself tightly, listening to the vast silence of the rail yard. Sleep came in fitful, short bursts, punctuated by the unsettling groans and metallic pops of the train chassis cooling in the night air. Each sound was amplified in the oppressive quiet, creating the illusion that something was moving just outside the compartment door. He spent the first week establishing a rhythm. In the early mornings, before the full light could expose his entry point, he would squeeze out of car 3 and scavenge the immediate vicinity. He found an abandoned water main that dripped slowly but steadily, allowing him to collect enough water in the crystal tumbler to survive. Food was the hardest, half-eaten sandwiches discarded near the yard entrance, or bruised fruit tossed from a passing truck. He ate little, but enough to maintain a low, desperate vitality. The train itself became his world. He had mentally mapped Car 3, but his curiosity finally drove him to explore the remaining cars. Car 1 was the baggage car. Cold, cavernous, and utterly empty, save for rows of metal shelving and the perpetual smell of canvas and leather. It felt like the train's lung, inhaling and exhaling only cold air. Car 5 was the dining car. This car was a revelation. It featured small, intimate booths, each adorned with a shaded lamp above the table, and a long serving counter that led into a galley. The galley was Loctite, but the dining area was accessible. The air here was subtly different. It held the ghost of food, not the reality. Elias could almost smell rich coffee, yeast rolls, and heavy spices. He spent hours tracing the grain of the teak tables, imagining the conversations that had taken place here. It was in Car 5, on the 10th night of his refuge, that the first true anomaly occurred. Elias had set up a small candle, a stub he had found near a statue in the park and carefully rationed, on one of the dining tables. The flickering light cast his own shadow in long, leaping distortions against the aisle wall. He was cleaning the crystal tumbler with a damp corner of his jacket when he heard it. It wasn't a metallic screech. It was a chink, a specific, delicate sound, like silverware touching porcelain. Elias froze, his spine locking rigid. He held his breath until his ears began to ring. The sound had come from the far end of the car, near the locked galley door. He rationalized quickly, settling metal. A rodent, the wind causing an object to shift. He waited 5 agonizing minutes. Silence returned, heavy and absolute. He blew out the candle, plunging the dining car into perfect inky darkness. He retreated slowly, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs, back toward the safety of Car 3. The next morning, driven by fear and a strange, compelling curiosity, he returned to Car 5. The dining car was exactly as he had left it, dusty, pristine in its abandonment. He checked the table where he had sat. Everything was still covered in the thick, undisturbed layer of grey dust, but as he approached the galley area, he stopped short. On the serving counter, where the dust lay heaviest, a patch had been wiped clean. It was a clear, oblong shape, about the size of a small place setting, and sitting neatly in the center of that cleaned patch was a thin, white porcelain saucer, delicately rimmed in gold. Elias knew, with a certainty that chilled him more than any cold air, that the saucer had not been there the day before. He had searched every accessible surface of the car. It had materialized. He reached out a trembling finger and touched the saucer. It was cold to the touch, heavy and very real. But there was no cup, no silverware, no surrounding debris. Just the single, perfect saucer sitting on a freshly wiped patch of dust in the deep silence of the abandoned train. Elias did not scream. He did not run. His trauma had conditioned him to accept the unreal when the reality was too painful to bear. He picked up the saucer, examining the underside. No markings, no clue. He carried it carefully back to Car 3, placing it on his small fold-down table like a sacred artifact. The train, he realized, was not entirely empty. It carried something else. The realization settled over him like a suffocating layer of the train's own stale atmosphere. He tried to rationalize it. A previous squatter, someone who had left a single item, but the dust on the saucer was absent. It was placed there recently. Over the next few days, the isolated incidents began to escalate, maintaining their subtle, non-threatening quality. In Car 7, the observation car, a sweeping section of glass windows offering a panoramic view of nothing but weeds and the rusted perimeter fence, Elias found a piece of paper. It was not a crumpled wrapper, but a careful, folded rectangle, slipped beneath the edge of the velvet bench seating. He unfolded it slowly. It was a drawing, Rendered in fading crayon, it depicted a small girl, perhaps 6 years old, with bright yellow hair and a disproportionately large smile, holding a red balloon. Below the figure, written in an unsteady, childish script, were the words, "Lily was here." Elias stared at the drawing until his eyes burned. Lily. That was the name he carried like a stone in his own chest. His younger sister. The memory of her was the catalyst for his flight, the overwhelming grief that had shattered his remaining world. He stood in the observation car, holding the drawing, the air suddenly growing dense and heavy, pressing against his lungs. He was alone, yet he felt profoundly observed. The silence of the car felt less like an absence of sound and more like a compression of unspoken words. He turned slowly, scanning the rows of empty benches. The light outside had faded to a bruised purple, and the reflection on the vast windows was now sharp and clear. In the reflection of the glass, he saw movement. It was not a shadow he cast, nor the movement of the outside world. It was internal, within the compartment, a vague, translucent distortion standing near the back wall. It was the shape of an old woman, perhaps, wearing a long, dark coat. She was completely silent, completely still. Her form seemed to flicker, like an image struggling to load on an old television screen. Terror, icy and absolute, seized Elias. He dropped the drawing. He did not wait. He fled the observation car, running down the narrow aisle of car 6, car 5, and finally diving headlong into the security of car 3. He slammed the compartment door shut and latched it. He pressed his back against the thick wood paneling, breathing in ragged, shallow gasps. He stayed awake all that night, staring into the darkness, listening. The train had passengers, but they were not living. They were the residual echoes of profound human emotion, solidified into almost visible forms by the train's isolation, and perhaps, crucially, by Elias's own overwhelming sorrow. He realized the train was a collector of grief. The next day, the fear had curdled into a strange, compelling necessity. He had nowhere else to go. Running meant returning to the cold, the hunger, and the explicit danger of the outside world. Here the danger was ethereal, sad, and contained. He returned to the observation car. The drawing was still on the floor, the little girl smiling brightly at the ceiling. Elias retrieved it, folding it carefully and slipping it into his jacket pocket, next to the useless compass. The spectral figure was not present in the harsh light of midday, but the atmosphere remained thick, saturated with an emotion he could not name, a quiet, enduring ache. Elias began to spend time in car 5 again, the dining car. He deliberately left the door to the galley ajar after checking the lock. He wanted to understand. That evening, as the light drained from the sky, Elias sat in car 5, carving a notch into the wooden frame of the booth with the sharp edge of his broken compass, marking the passage of his tenure in the train. He looked up, and she was there. The figure stood near the serving counter, much clearer this time. She was a woman in her late 40s, wearing an elegant, slightly dated traveling suit of muted teal. Her hair was pulled back severely, and her posture spoke of immense, unyielding formality. Her features were sad, drawn tight with decades of internal pressure, and her eyes, though lacking pupils or color, conveyed a sense of infinite distance. She was transparent, yet her edges were crisp against the shadows. Elias simply stared. He did not move, recognizing that she was not a predator, but an exhibit of profound sorrow. As he watched, the woman raised her hand slowly, an elegant, almost courtly gesture. She moved her lips, and Elias heard, not with his ears, but deep within the quiet chamber of his own mind, a voice that sounded like brittle, dry leaves scratching across stone. He did not look back. The words were heavy with finality, a statement of enduring pain, repeated perhaps 1,000 times in the silence of that car. Elias swallowed the knot in his throat. He felt the weight of her sadness shift, pressing slightly against his own chest. He spoke softly, his voice a dry, reedy whisper in the vast car. "Who didn't look back?" The woman did not react to his voice in a traditional way. She did not turn her head or change her expression. But the image of her intensified, the edges sharpening, as if his acknowledgement fueled her spectral presence. The platform, the distance. He promised the letters would come, every week. The train always moves too quickly, you see. It takes everything away. Elias understood. This woman was caught in a moment of abandonment, a profound emotional severance that occurred on a train platform long ago. She was the residual sorrow of that moment, preserved here. "Did you go after him?" Elias asked. The woman raised her translucent hand again, pointing toward the window, which showed only the distorted reflection of the rusted fence. "I cannot move. I wait for the telegram. But the journey ended here." Elias realized that the abandoned train was the terminus for her hope. She was Mrs. Delphine, frozen in the agony of waiting for a message that would never arrive. He spent the next hour simply sitting in her presence. The deep emotional drama was agonizing. He felt not only his own loneliness, but the weight of her unending expectation. When he finally stood up, his legs were stiff, and his heart felt heavy, burdened by the secondary grief. When he looked back from the doorway, Mrs. Delphine was gone. The only sign of her existence was the faint, sweet scent of dried lavender, the smell he had noticed upon his first entry into the car. Elias began to seek them out. He became the caretaker of the train's sorrows. He found another figure in Car 7, the observation car. This was Silas, an elderly man with a great bushy beard that shimmered like fine silver thread. Silas did not pace. He sat motionless on the velvet bench, his hands resting on the gold handle of a phantom cane. Silas spoke only of paths not taken. He communicated through images, flickering scenes of a sprawling farm bathed in golden light, the rough texture of a wooden fence, the smell of fresh-cut hay. "The ticket was for the coast. I was supposed to start again. But when I saw the ocean, I knew the journey had been a flight, not a start. I should have stayed in the valley." Silas's presence was heavy with the deep regret of inaction. Elias listened, sensing the difference between Mrs. Delphine's sharp pain of abandonment and Silas's dull, pervasive ache of self-blame. "It's too late to go back now," Elias whispered to Silas, the words echoing his own internal fear. Silas's form pulsed slightly, reflecting the boy's admission. "The clock stops when the decision is made. I live in the moment of my regret." The emotional consequence of these interactions was profound. Elias was no longer merely lonely. He was steeped in a shared atmosphere of historical, unresolved grief. His own loss, Lily's sudden illness, the devastating quiet that followed, his parents' subsequent emotional collapse, and his final panicked flight felt magnified, intensified by the concentration of sorrow within the silver comet. He realized the train was attracting him because he was a vessel of fresh, immense grief. He was a new passenger, meant to join the collection of lingering sadnesses. One afternoon, Elias was back in Car 3, his own compartment, attempting to clean the dust from the window, desperate for a clearer view of the sky. He had placed the crystal tumbler and the lily drawing on the small fold-down table. He heard a slight, high-pitched scrape, like a finger tracing the grain of the wood. Sitting on the edge of the opposite bunk was a third figure. This one was small, about Elias's own height, and his transparency was the most volatile yet. He flickered constantly as if struggling to remain present. He wore outdated woolen shorts and a button-up shirt. This was Leo. Leo was different from Mrs. Delphine and Silas. Leo carried a fear so raw, so close to the surface, that it made Elias shiver despite the car's preserved warmth. Leo was the fear of being separated from everything known and loved. Leo did not speak of past journeys or broken promises. He only spoke of immediate environment. The dark is too wide. The space between the beds is too far. If I sleep, the train will move without me. Leo was trapped in the anxiety of transition, the moment between departure and arrival, magnified by the cold reality of abandonment. Elias recognized the paralyzing terror. He remembered the night he had left his own house, slipping out the back door, convinced that if he stayed, the crushing silence of his parents' grief would physically crush him. "I won't let the train move," Elias promised the flickering image. "It's been here for years. It's stuck." Leo's eyes, the faint, colorless orbs, fastened onto Elias. "You are afraid too. You ran from the silence. The silence is where the bad things wait." Elias felt his own vulnerability exposed, laid bare by this spectral child. Leo was a mirror, reflecting the core trauma of the 11-year-old runaway. "The bad thing is the memory," Elias whispered, his voice catching. "The memory of the light going out." He looked down at the drawing of Lily, the oversized, joyous smile. He had run from the silence that followed her death, the silence that consumed his mother and father. The drama escalated subtly. As Elias spent more time with Leo, Mrs. Delphine, and Silas, their proximity began to affect him physically. He developed a permanent ache in his chest, not hunger, but a profound spiritual pressure. He was absorbing their sorrow, consolidating the abandoned grief of the silver comet. The train itself seemed to resonate with this heightened emotional state. The metallic groans were louder, more frequent, sounding like long, slow sobs echoing through the structure. The air grew thicker, heavier, occasionally carrying scents that shouldn't exist: stale pipe tobacco, faint traces of lavender, and the sharp, fleeting scent of cheap bubblegum. Elias realized that he was reaching a critical point. He was becoming too much a part of the train, too intertwined with the sorrow. If he remained, he would cease to be Elias and become simply another lingering echo, another unexpressed tragedy trapped within the steel walls. He had to release them. But to release them, he first had to release himself. The climax gathered momentum in Car 7, the observation car, under the light of a fractured cold moon that spilled through the massive windows. Elias took his meager inventory with him: the crystal tumbler, the broken compass, and the drawing of Lily. He left his jacket behind in Car 3. He needed to feel the cold, the clarity of the raw air. He sat on the velvet bench, right where Silas often rested. He waited. The atmosphere began to thicken immediately. The air cooled dramatically, and the silence became taut, stretched to the breaking point. First came Mrs. Delphine, appearing near the entrance to the car, her teal suit elegant and spectral, her eyes fixed on an infinite, distant platform. She was waiting for the telegram that would signal resolution. Then Silas materialized, sitting heavily at the far end of the car, his beard shimmering, his gaze fixed on the ghost of the valley he had abandoned for the coast. He was waiting for the chance to rewind the clock. And finally, Leo appeared, sitting next to Elias, close enough that Elias could feel the cold, static energy of his anxiety. Leo was trembling, not from cold, but from sheer terror of isolation. He was waiting for reassurance that he was not forgotten. Elias was trapped between 3 epochs of emotional stasis: abandonment, regret, and fear. He held the crystal tumbler in his hands. It felt fragile and heavy at the same time. He needed to speak the core of his own pain, the memory he had been running from, to create a rupture in this emotional containment field. He started simply, his voice cracking, directing his words toward the huge, reflective windows, toward the night sky, toward the vast, uncaring city beyond the fence. "I didn't look back either," Elias whispered, acknowledging Mrs. Delphine. "When I walked away from the house, I walked fast. I didn't look to see if the lights were off, or if my mother was crying in the kitchen. I just ran from the quiet. The quiet was the worst noise." Mrs. Delphine's form flickered slightly, a tremor of recognition passing through her spectral shape. Elias turned the crystal tumbler over in his hands. I shouldn't have left. I know that now. I left them because they were drowning, and I thought I was the only one who could save myself. He looked at Silas, the old man of regret. There is no path back to the valley, Silas. There's no undoing the ticket purchase. My sister Lily, she got sick so fast. 1 week she was drawing pictures of balloons, and the next she was gone. I remember the last time I saw her. I was angry because she drew on my textbook. I yelled. I told her I hated her picture. Elias stopped, a painful, dry sob catching in his throat. This memory, this specific detail of petty anger, was the fuel for his internal flight. I ran away because I couldn't stand the memory of those final words being so small, so stupid. I should have told her that I loved her picture. I should have told her I loved her. He felt the atmosphere in the observation car tighten further. The pressure was enormous, forcing the air out of his lungs. He felt the weight of Silas's regret settling upon him, magnifying his own guilt. I missed my chance. I was supposed to be the older brother, the protector, but I abandoned them all. I abandoned her memory. Elias reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out the drawing, the crude crayon rendering of Lily holding the red balloon. He held the drawing up for Leo, the terrified spectral boy, to see. You're afraid of being forgotten, Leo. You're afraid the train will leave without you. I promise you, I remember this drawing. I remember everything about Lily, every color, every smile. As Elias spoke the name Lily and articulated the specific sharp edge of his guilt, the reaction of the spectral passengers was immediate and dramatic, but profoundly subtle. Mrs. Delphine, fixed at the door, slowly, almost imperceptibly, turned her head away from the distant platform. Her intense focus on the external world shattered. She was looking inward, past Elias, into the vastness of the car. Her form began to dissipate at the edges, thinning like fine smoke caught in a gentle breeze. The lavender scent diminished, replaced by the clean, neutral scent of dust and old wood. Silas, the man of regret, closed his eyes. The tension that had held his spectral body rigid for decades visibly relaxed. The phantom cane he gripped vanished. The visions of the Golden Valley and the restless ocean faded from the air. Silas had acknowledged that the decision was made, and the eternal pressure of what if was released. Leo, sitting beside Elias, began to tremble violently, not with fear, but with release. I remember you, Elias said to Leo, clutching the drawing. I remember the fear of separation, but we are not separated. Lily is gone, but the memory of her joy is here, and that joy is stronger than the running, and stronger than the quiet. Elias placed the drawing of Lily gently on the velvet bench between them. As the physical object touched the surface, Leo's form stabilized for a terrifying, fleeting instant. He looked utterly clear, like a real child, his eyes focused and deep. Then, with a sigh that was only heard in the deepest part of Elias's consciousness, Leo faded entirely. He was not erased violently. He simply ceased to hold the physical space. The smell of bubble gum was gone. Elias was left alone in the observation car. The oppressive, heavy atmosphere was lifting, dissipating like fog under a morning sun. The car was merely dusty again, cold and vast. He sat for a long time, breathing deeply, the air now feeling clean, sterile, and empty. The weight on his chest had vanished. He was still profoundly sad, but it was his sadness, not the accumulated sorrow of the silver comet. It was manageable. He retrieved the drawing and the crystal tumbler. He walked slowly back through the empty cars. Car 5, the dining car, was just a structure of wood and metal. The lingering scent of coffee and spices was absent. Car 3, his refuge, felt spacious now, less of a sanctuary and more of a temporary shelter. He picked up his heavy denim jacket. It was still hours before dawn, the darkest part of the night. Elias knew he could not stay. The train had served its purpose. It had forced him to stop running and to face the specific, terrible detail of his guilt. By speaking his truth, he had inadvertently given the Silver Comet's residual passengers the resolution they needed to finally depart their long-delayed terminus. He gathered his few possessions and moved toward the ventilation access. He paused, looking back at the small compartment, the place that had protected him during the longest, loneliest period of his young life. The crystal tumbler he placed carefully on the fold-down table. It was too beautiful to discard, but he could not carry the weight of its perfection outside the train. He slipped out through the access panel, scraping his hip on the rebar again, but this time the pain was merely physical, sharp and clean, not laced with existential terror. He slid back through the brambles, ignoring the stinging cuts on his forearms, stepping out onto the cold gravel of the juniper rail yard. The sky was beginning to pale with the approach of dawn, a harsh, unforgiving grey that promised a bitter day. Elias stood at the perimeter of the yard, the abandoned train silent behind him, a dark, motionless monument to journeys that never finished. He pulled the drawing of Lily from his pocket, unfolding it, looking at the vivid yellow hair and the red balloon. This was not a memory of pain, but a relic of love. This he carried. He adjusted his jacket, pulled the broken compass from his pocket, and stared at the useless spinning needle. Direction didn't matter, only forward motion. Elias walked toward the rising grey light, stepping away from the rust, the silence, and the profound, beautiful sorrow of the abandoned train. The weight was gone, replaced by the deep, enduring courage of having faced, acknowledged, and finally released the ghosts of the past, both the train's and his own. He was still only 11, but he walked with the measured, steady pace of someone who knew exactly what he was carrying and exactly where he was going, toward a future where the silence was not a threat, but simply the space between his own words.